You feel guilty, even when you did nothing wrong and you don't know why. The guilt that doesn't make sense. You did nothing wrong. You know you didn't. And still, you feel like you need to apologize. You replay the situation. You analyze every word. You consider every angle. And still, something inside you won't settle. There's a voice that keeps coming back, quiet, persistent, asking the same question. What if it was your fault? Not because you made a mistake, not because you hurt someone, but because that voice has been there for so long and it feels like you. This is the kind of guilt that has no logic. It shows up after you set a boundary, after you say no, after you finally choose yourself. And somehow, that's exactly when it feels like you did something wrong. Now you're holding two realities at once, the one you can see and the one you feel. They don't match. And that gap between knowing you're right and feeling like you're wrong is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have. Most people think guilt is a signal, a sign that something needs to be corrected. But what if that's not true? What if guilt can become automatic, so deeply ingrained that it activates even when there's nothing to fix? Then it's no longer guidance, it's conditioning. And conditioning doesn't ask for permission. It runs quietly in the background, long after the reason is gone. So before you question yourself again, ask something more honest. Not, what did I do wrong? But, why do I feel wrong when I know I'm not? When being right still feels wrong. There's something uniquely painful about this experience. Not the kind of pain that comes from making a mistake. That pain at least makes sense. You did something wrong. You feel bad. There's a logic to it. This is different. This is the pain of standing on solid ground and still feeling like you're sinking. You were clear, you were honest. Maybe you finally said something you'd been holding back for too long. Maybe you refused something that wasn't yours to carry. Maybe you simply told the truth and the other person didn't like it, and now instead of feeling relief, you feel guilt. Instead of feeling free, you feel like you did something wrong. Why does that happen? Because the mind doesn't always process emotions the way logic processes facts. Logic looks at the situation and says, you were right. But the emotional mind looks at the reaction, the tension, the silence, the discomfort, and registers something else entirely. It registers something is broken, and automatically asks, did I break it? This is where the confusion begins, not in the situation itself, but in the way the emotional mind interprets the aftermath. When someone is upset after a conflict, the conditioned mind doesn't ask, are they responsible for their reaction? It asks, what did I do to cause this? That shift from observation to self-blame happens so fast you barely notice it. One moment you're standing in your truth, the next you're apologizing for it. And here's what makes this pattern so difficult to break. It feels like empathy. It feels like responsibility. It feels like you're being the bigger person. But there's a difference between genuine accountability and reflexive self-blame. Accountability says, I did something wrong, and I want to understand it. Reflexive self-blame says, something went wrong, so it must be me. One is honest. The other is automatic. And when guilt becomes automatic, it stops being a guide. It becomes a prison. A place where you return every time things get uncomfortable, every time someone is unhappy, every time a situation doesn't resolve the way you hoped. Not because you belong there, but because some part of you was trained to go there first. The silent voice that questions you. There's a voice inside you that you've probably never questioned, not because it's too loud, but because it's too quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't argue, it doesn't demand attention. It simply appears. In the pause after a difficult conversation, in the silence after you say no, in the moment between action and reflection. And it always sounds reasonable. Maybe I could have handled that better. Maybe I was too harsh, maybe they had a point. It doesn't sound like self-destruction. It sounds like self-reflection. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because self-reflection is healthy. The ability to look at yourself honestly, to consider your role in a situation, to ask if you could have done better. That's not weakness. That's maturity. But this voice isn't doing that. This voice isn't helping you grow. It's keeping you small. There's a fundamental difference between asking what can I learn from this and asking what's wrong with me. One moves forward, the other circles back, endlessly, over the same moment, the same conversation, the same decision you already made and can no longer change. And yet the voice keeps returning. Why? Because it was never about the situation in front of you. That voice formed long before this moment, long before this conflict, long before this relationship. It was built in quieter times, in early experiences where questioning yourself was the safest response, where keeping the peace mattered more than speaking your truth, where being accepted required making yourself smaller. The voice learned that self-doubt was useful, that if you questioned yourself first, others wouldn't have to question you, that if you blamed yourself quickly, the conflict would end faster. And for a time, it worked. But patterns that once protected you don't disappear when the danger does. They stay, they adapt. They find new situations to apply themselves to, even when those situations no longer require them. So now, in moments that have nothing to do with survival, the voice still shows up, still questioning, still doubting, still asking if you were wrong, even when you weren't. And the longer that voice goes unexamined, the more authority it gains. Not because it's right, but because silence feels like agreement. You learn to doubt yourself. This guilt didn't start with you. That's one of the hardest things to accept, because it feels so personal. It feels like your voice, your reaction, your problem to solve. But doubt at this level is never spontaneous. It was taught, not in a classroom, not through direct instruction, but through something far more powerful, repeated experience. Through the slow accumulation of moments where your perception was questioned, your feelings were dismissed, or your truth was met with disapproval. Think about what happens to a child who expresses something genuine, anger, sadness, a need, a boundary, and is told directly or indirectly that what they feel is wrong, that they're overreacting, that they're too sensitive, that they're making things difficult. The child doesn't conclude that the adult is wrong. The child concludes that they are, because that's the only interpretation that makes sense when you're small and the world around you is large. When the people who define your reality, who provide your safety, your food, your belonging, tell you that what you feel isn't real, you don't fight back. You adapt. You learn to question yourself before anyone else can. You learn to scan your own behavior for errors before the conversation even begins. You learn to preemptively apologize, to soften your truth, to wrap your needs in so many layers of justification that by the time you express them, they barely resemble what you actually felt. And this becomes your baseline, not a conscious choice, not a strategy you selected, a reflex, an automatic response so embedded in how you move through the world that it stops feeling like adaptation and starts feeling like identity. This is just who I am. I'm someone who overthinks. I'm someone who feels guilty easily. I'm just too sensitive. But that's not identity. That's a learned pattern presenting itself as one. And there's a crucial difference, because identity feels permanent. Patterns can be seen, and once you can see a pattern clearly, it begins to lose its power over you. The moment you understand that your self-doubt was a response to something external, not a reflection of something broken inside you, everything shifts. Not immediately, not completely, but the ground beneath the guilt starts to change, because now you're not asking what's wrong with me. You're asking something far more honest. What did I learn, and does it still serve me? The pattern hidden beneath the guilt. Most people try to fix guilt by fixing the situation. They apologize. They explain more than necessary. They replay the conversation, searching for a different version of themselves, one that wouldn't have caused this feeling. But the feeling doesn't go away, because it was never about the situation. The situation was just the trigger. What you're feeling comes from something older, something structural, a pattern so deeply embedded in the way you process reality that it activates before your conscious mind even understands what's happening. That's what makes it invisible. When you're inside a pattern, you don't see it as a pattern. You experience it as truth. It feels like this moment, this conversation, this person. So naturally, you try to solve it here, in the present, where it doesn't actually exist. Think about it. When guilt appears after you set a boundary, is it really about the boundary, or is it about what boundaries once meant to you? The tension they created, the rejection they triggered, the silence that followed when you were younger, when you had far less ground to stand on. When guilt shows up after you say no, is it really about this moment, or is it about every time you said no and felt something shift, the room changing, the approval disappearing, that subtle movement from accepted to unwanted? The present moment is not creating the weight, it's borrowing it. That's why your reaction feels bigger than it should. That's why you can know, clearly, logically, that you did nothing wrong, and still feel like you did. Because logic responds to facts. But patterns respond to familiarity, and this feeling, the one that tells you you caused this, you need to fix this, you need to make this right, is familiar. Not because it's true, but because it's old. This is the pattern hidden beneath the guilt. Not a flaw, not weakness, not proof that you're too sensitive. A strategy, one that made sense once. It helped you navigate environments where self-doubt was safer than self-trust, where keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. And for a time it worked. But patterns don't disappear when the environment changes. They persist, they update the context, but keep the same logic. So now, in situations that have nothing to do with your past, the same reaction activates, same tension, same self-questioning, same urge to fix something that was never broken. And until you see that clearly, you'll keep solving the wrong problem. You'll keep trying to fix the situation. You'll keep adjusting your words, softening your truth, revisiting moments that didn't need revision, because it feels like the present is the issue, but it isn't. The present is just where the pattern appears, so the question changes. It's no longer, why do I feel guilty? It becomes something far more precise, something that actually leads somewhere. Where did I learn that I should? The need to keep peace at any cost. There's a version of kindness that isn't kindness at all. It looks like patience. It looks like flexibility. It looks like being easy to be around, easy to talk to, easy to love. But underneath it, there's fear. The fear of what happens when the peace breaks. Most people who carry chronic guilt are not weak. They're not naive. They're not even conflict-averse in the way that word is usually meant. They're something more specific than that. They're people who learned very early that harmony had a price, and that the price was usually paid by them. So they got good at it. Exceptionally good. They learned to read the room before anyone else did, to sense the shift in someone's mood before it became visible, to adjust their tone, their words, their needs in real time, so that the tension never had a chance to fully form. And it worked. The conflict was avoided. The atmosphere stayed calm. The relationship continued without rupture. But here's what that constant adjustment costs. Every time you change what you were about to say, because you sensed it might cause discomfort, you betray a small piece of your truth. Every time you soften a boundary, because the other person's reaction made you doubt whether the boundary was fair, you move slightly further from yourself. Every time you absorb someone else's discomfort and carry it as your own responsibility, you add another layer to the weight. None of these moments feel dramatic. That's the point. They're small, quiet, almost invisible. A word swallowed here, a feeling dismissed there, a need postponed one again, because this didn't feel like the right moment. But small things accumulate. And over time, the person who was trying to keep the peace starts to lose themselves in it. Because peace that requires your silence isn't peace, it's suppression with a pleasant surface. And the guilt that follows, the guilt you feel after finally speaking, after finally refusing, after finally drawing a line, that guilt isn't evidence that you did something wrong. It's the echo of every time you didn't. It's the system reacting to unfamiliarity. Because for so long keeping quiet felt safe, and speaking felt dangerous. So now even when speaking is exactly right, the body remembers the danger, the mind sends the alarm, and you feel guilty for doing something that was, in every real sense, necessary. The need to keep peace at any cost doesn't come from love. It comes from a deep, unspoken belief that conflict means loss, that if things get uncomfortable enough, someone will leave, something will break. You will be too much or not enough. And the relationship, the connection, the belonging you've been carefully maintaining will disappear. That belief was formed in a specific context, but it travels everywhere with you. And until you examine it, until you ask whether peace purchased through self-erasure is actually worth keeping, the pattern will continue. You will keep paying a price that was never yours to pay. When responsibility becomes distorted, there's a quality that looks like virtue from the outside. It looks like conscientiousness, like care, like someone who takes their role in relationships seriously, who doesn't make excuses, who reflects on their behavior, who genuinely tries to do right by the people around them. But when you look closer, something is off, because this person doesn't just take responsibility for what they do. They take responsibility for what everyone around them feels. And that's a different thing entirely. Responsibility for your actions is healthy. It's necessary. It's the foundation of integrity. When you do something that causes harm, acknowledging it, sitting with it, understanding it, making it right, that's not weakness, that's maturity. But responsibility for other people's emotional states, for their reactions, their moods, their disappointment, their silence, that's not responsibility, that's overreach. And it's one of the most exhausting places a person can live. Because other people's emotions are not yours to manage. Their reactions belong to them. Their disappointment, however real, however visible, is shaped by their own history, their own expectations, their own unresolved patterns. You may have played a role in triggering it, but you are not the author of it. There's a moment in almost every difficult conversation where this confusion happens. Someone reacts strongly, with hurt or anger or withdrawal, and the person prone to distorted responsibility doesn't think they're having a reaction. They think, I caused this. And immediately, before any reflection, before any honest assessment, they begin to adjust, to apologize, to find the part of themselves that must be to blame. Even when there is no such part. This is the distortion, not the care itself. Care is not the problem, but the automatic equation between someone else's discomfort and your own wrongdoing. The equation that says, if they're hurting, I must have caused it. If they're upset, I must fix it. If there's tension, it's my responsibility to dissolve it, regardless of what actually happened. That equation was learned in environments where someone else's emotional state determined whether you were safe, where a parent's mood meant the difference between connection and coldness, where you had to read the room constantly, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, where your emotional radar became so finely tuned that you could sense a shift in atmosphere before most people even noticed anything had changed. That skill kept you safe then, but now it keeps you trapped, because you're still applying it, still scanning, still adjusting, still absorbing, still assuming that the emotional weight in the room belongs to you, that it's yours to carry, yours to fix, yours to resolve. And the guilt that comes with all of this isn't random. It's the direct result of believing you are responsible for things you were never meant to control. The Stoics had a word for this kind of confusion. They called it a failure to distinguish between what is yours and what is not, between what lies within your power and what lies outside it. Your actions are yours. Your intentions are yours. Your words, your choices, your responses, those belong to you. You are accountable for them. But another person's reaction? That belongs to them. And carrying it as if it were yours doesn't make you a better person. It just makes you a heavier one. The fear behind the guilt. Guilt rarely travels alone. If you follow it far enough, past the surface of the feeling, past the story it tells about what you did or didn't do, you will almost always find something else underneath it, something older, something quieter, something that has very little to do with the situation in front of you. You will find fear. Not the fear of having done something wrong. That would be simpler. That kind of fear has a clear object, a mistake, a consequence, a repair that needs to be made. This fear is different. This is the fear of what happens if you stop feeling guilty. Because guilt, as painful as it is, serves a function. It keeps you in a particular position, one that feels on some level safer than the alternative. As long as you're the one who might be wrong, you remain in a familiar role. The one who reflects, the one who adjusts, the one who tries harder. And trying harder feels like control. If you're the problem, then you can also be the solution. If it's your fault, then you have the power to fix it. And that belief, however painful, is easier to hold than the alternative. The alternative being, sometimes things go wrong and it has nothing to do with you. Sometimes people react the way they do because of their own history, their own wounds, their own unresolved patterns. Sometimes there is no one to blame. And sometimes, even when you did everything right, the outcome still hurt. That's harder to sit with, because it means accepting something the guilt-prone mind resists deeply, that you are not in control of other people, that you cannot prevent all pain, that you cannot make everyone comfortable, that your best effort will sometimes not be enough. Not because you failed, but because some things are simply beyond your reach. Guilt protects you from that truth. It says if only you had done something differently, this wouldn't have happened. And that story, as heavy as it is, gives you somewhere to put the discomfort. It gives the mind something to work with, something to analyze, something to correct, something to improve. The alternative, accepting that you were right and it still ended in tension, gives you nothing to fix. And for a mind trained to manage, to adjust, to resolve, that emptiness is terrifying. But there's something else underneath the guilt, something even more fundamental. The fear of rejection. Not rejection in the dramatic sense, not the fear of being publicly abandoned or humiliated, but the quiet, chronic fear of being seen as difficult, as selfish, as too much, as not enough, as someone who causes problems rather than solving them. This fear is what makes you apologize when you have nothing to apologize for, what makes you soften truths that didn't need softening, what makes you take back boundaries the moment you sense resistance. Because somewhere, at a level below conscious thought, there is a belief running quietly in the background. If I make people uncomfortable, I will lose them. And losing them, losing the connection, the approval, the sense of belonging, feels like a threat to something essential. So the guilt becomes a kind of offering, a way of saying, I'm not a threat, I'm not difficult, I'm aware, I'm trying, please don't leave. It's not manipulative, it's not strategic, it's completely unconscious. But it shapes everything. Every apology you didn't owe, every boundary you abandoned, every truth you swallowed, every moment you chose harmony over honesty. Not because harmony was right, but because honesty felt too dangerous. The fear behind the guilt doesn't announce itself. It just quietly steers. And until you turn toward it, until you look at it directly and ask where it came from, what it's protecting, and whether that protection is still necessary, it will keep running the show. From behind the guilt, in the silence, where you've never thought to look, the Jungian shadow you avoid. Carl Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we refuse to see don't disappear. They go underground. They become what he called the shadow. Not a dark or evil force, but simply the collection of everything we've pushed out of our conscious awareness. The feelings we decided were unacceptable, the impulses we learned to suppress, the truths we buried because expressing them felt too dangerous, too selfish, too much. The shadow doesn't vanish because you ignore it. It finds other ways to express itself, and one of the most common ways it does that is through guilt. Think about what happens when you feel guilty for something you didn't do wrong. On the surface, it looks like sensitivity, like conscientiousness, like someone who cares deeply about their impact on others. But look closer. Underneath that guilt, there is often something that was never allowed to exist openly, anger that was never expressed, a boundary that was never set, a truth that was swallowed so many times it started to feel like it didn't exist. You didn't make those things disappear. You just moved them into the shadow. And now they sit there, unacknowledged, unexpressed, unresolved, creating a kind of internal pressure that has to go somewhere. And it goes into guilt, into self-doubt, into the chronic sense that something is wrong with you, even when everything on the surface looks fine. This is what Jung understood that most surface-level psychology misses. The problem is rarely what it appears to be. The guilt you feel isn't really about this situation. It's about every situation where you had a legitimate response: anger, frustration, disappointment, a clear and firm no, and suppressed it, smoothed it over, translated it into something more acceptable, something that wouldn't disturb the peace or risk the relationship. Every time you did that, you added something to the shadow, and the shadow grows heavier with every addition. Now here's where it becomes truly important. The parts of yourself you push into the shadow don't just sit there passively. They begin to shape how you see the world. They create blind spots. They distort your perception of situations, making things that are neutral feel threatening, making people who are simply disagreeing feel like they're attacking you, making the act of standing in your own truth feel like an act of aggression, because somewhere inside, your own suppressed anger feels dangerous to you. Your own unexpressed needs feel like too much. Your own truth, the real, unfiltered version of what you think and feel, feels like a weapon you can't be trusted to hold, so you keep it in the shadow, and you feel guilty instead, because guilt is familiar. Guilt is safe. Guilt keeps you in the position of the one who reflects, who adjusts, who tries to be better. It keeps you from having to face the things you've been avoiding, the anger that felt unacceptable, the needs that felt selfish, the boundaries that felt dangerous. But here's what Jung also understood. The shadow is not the enemy. It's information. Every piece of yourself you've pushed underground is telling you something. The anger you suppressed is telling you that something crossed a line. The need you dismissed is telling you that something matters to you deeply. The truth you swallowed is telling you that you have a perspective that deserves to exist. The guilt you feel when you're right isn't proof that you're wrong. It's a signal that somewhere inside you, there's a part of yourself that has been waiting, quietly, patiently, for a very long time, to be acknowledged. Not to take over, not to cause destruction, just to be seen. And the moment you stop running from that part of yourself, the moment you turn toward the shadow instead of away from it, the guilt begins to lose its grip, because you no longer need it to keep the hidden parts of you contained. You're finally willing to look at what's actually there. The moment you betray yourself, it rarely happens all at once. That's the part no one talks about. Self-betrayal doesn't usually arrive as a single dramatic moment, a choice so obvious you can look back and say, that's where it happened. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a betrayal when it's occurring. It feels like being reasonable. It feels like keeping the peace, like being mature, like choosing your battles, like not making everything into a bigger issue than it needs to be. And in the moment, that framing feels completely justified. But underneath the justification, something happened. You had a clear perception, a genuine reaction, a truth that was real and present and yours. And instead of staying with it, instead of letting it exist, expressing it, honoring it, you moved away from it quickly, quietly, almost automatically. Almost. Maybe you were in a conversation and you felt something shift inside you. A clear sense that what was being said wasn't right, that you were being misrepresented, that something important was being overlooked. And you started to say something. You opened your mouth. And then you felt the resistance, the tension in the room, the other person's expression changing. The subtle signal that what you were about to say was going to make things harder. So you changed it. You softened it. You qualified it. You wrapped it in so many layers of consideration that by the time it came out it barely resembled what you actually felt, or you said nothing at all and told yourself it wasn't worth it. That moment, right there. That's the betrayal. Not because you were obligated to start a conflict, not because every truth needs to be spoken out loud in every moment, but because your reason for pulling back wasn't wisdom. It wasn't timing. It wasn't genuine discernment about when to speak and when to wait. It was fear. The fear of the reaction, the fear of the tension, the fear of being seen as difficult, as aggressive, as someone who makes things hard. And fear is a terrible editor of truth. What it cuts away isn't the unnecessary parts. It cuts away the real parts, the parts that were inconvenient, the parts that might have caused discomfort, the parts that were most authentically yours. And here's what accumulates over time. Each small betrayal creates a precedent. Your own mind begins to learn, through repetition, through reinforcement, that your truth is negotiable, that your perception can be adjusted depending on the circumstances, that what you feel is valid only up to the point where it starts to cause friction, and once that learning is established, it becomes harder and harder to trust yourself, not because your perceptions are wrong, but because you've spent so long overriding them that you can no longer tell the difference between genuine reconsideration and automatic self-erasure. You start second-guessing yourself before anyone else even challenges you. You start editing your thoughts before they're fully formed, adjusting your reactions before you've even allowed yourself to feel them, anticipating disapproval and preemptively removing whatever might cause it. And all of this happens in seconds, below the level of conscious awareness, so fast and so familiar that it feels like thinking, when really it's flinching. This is the cost of repeated self-betrayal, not a single catastrophic loss, but a slow erosion of the one relationship that underlies every other relationship in your life, your relationship with your own perception. When that erodes, when you can no longer fully trust what you see, what you feel, what you know, you become dependent on external signals to tell you what's real. You look to others for confirmation. You wait for someone else to validate your experience before you allow yourself to fully own it. And in that dependency, the guilt finds its most fertile ground. Because now every time someone reacts badly, every time there's tension, every time someone is unhappy, your untrusting mind doesn't ask, are they right? It already assumes the answer. Of course they are. Because you stopped trusting yourself long before this moment. The betrayal didn't start here, it just became visible here. Why you apologize when you shouldn't. There's a specific kind of apology that has nothing to do with remorse. It doesn't come from genuine reflection. It doesn't follow an honest assessment of what happened. It doesn't arise from the recognition that you caused harm and want to make it right. It comes from discomfort, from the unbearable tension of someone being upset, from the silence that follows a difficult moment, from the subtle but unmistakable signal that the other person is not okay, and the automatic, almost physical need to do something about that. So you apologize, not because you believe you were wrong, but because the apology ends the tension. It breaks the silence, it moves things forward, it restores, at least on the surface, a sense of harmony. And harmony, even artificial harmony, feels like relief. But there's a price. Every apology you offer without genuine cause teaches your own mind something. It reinforces at a level below conscious thought the belief that you were wrong, that your position was indefensible, that the other person's discomfort was, in fact, your fault. You didn't just smooth over the situation, you confirmed the guilt. And the next time a similar moment arrives, the next time you set a boundary, the next time you say something honest, the next time you hold your ground, the guilt will come faster. Because now it has evidence, a pattern of behavior that says, when things get uncomfortable, you back down. When someone is upset, you take responsibility. When there's tension, you are the one who resolves it, regardless of what actually happened. This is how the pattern deepens, not through dramatic ruptures, through small, repeated confirmations, and the apologies themselves begin to change shape. They become preemptive. You start apologizing before anyone has even expressed displeasure. You soften statements before delivering them, adding qualifiers, disclaimers, acknowledgements of the other person's perspective, not because those additions are honest, but because they reduce the risk of conflict. I might be wrong, but maybe I'm overthinking this, but I don't want to make this into a big deal, but these phrases feel like humility. They sound like openness, but often they're armor, a way of preemptively diminishing your own position so that it lands with less impact, so that it's harder to push back against because you've already pushed back against it yourself. You've learned to argue against your own truth before anyone else gets the chance. And that's not humility, that's preemptive self-erasure. The Stoics were remarkably clear about this. They understood that social pressure, the weight of other people's expectations, reactions, and disapproval, is one of the most powerful forces that pulls a person away from their own judgment. And they identified something important. The person who abandons their position not because they were genuinely persuaded, but because the discomfort of holding it became too great, has not updated their view. They've just surrendered it. And there's a profound difference between those two things. Changing your mind because you encountered a better argument, because someone showed you something you hadn't considered, because honest reflection revealed a genuine blind spot. That's growth. That's intellectual integrity. That's exactly the kind of reconsideration that leads to wisdom. But changing your position because someone's reaction made you uncomfortable, because the silence got too heavy, because the look on someone's face made you feel like you were causing damage just by standing where you stood, that's not reconsideration. That's capitulation dressed as humility. And the cost of it, paid quietly over time in small installments, is the gradual loss of your own voice. Not the voice that speaks out loud, the internal one. The one that knows what you actually think. The one that registers what's real before the editing begins. The one that recognized the truth of the situation before the fear of the reaction moved in and started rearranging things. That voice doesn't disappear, but it learns to speak more quietly, and you learn to listen to it less, until one day you find yourself in a situation where you know, clearly, completely, that you were right, and you still apologize, not because you believe it, but because you've forgotten what it feels like not to. The Stoic line between you and others. The Stoics drew a line, not a metaphorical line, not a suggestion, a fundamental distinction that they considered the foundation of every form of inner freedom. The line between what is yours and what is not. Epictetus called it the dichotomy of control, and he was remarkably direct about it. Some things are within your power, he said, and some things are not. And the entire project of living well, of maintaining clarity, stability, and integrity in the face of everything life brings, depends on knowing which is which. What is yours? Your thoughts, your intentions, your choices, your responses, the values you decide to live by, the standards you hold yourself to, the way you interpret what happens to you and what you decide to do about it. These belong to you. What is not yours? Everything else. Other people's reactions, their opinions, their emotional states, their interpretations of your behavior, the conclusions they draw about your intentions, the stories they tell about who you are and why you do what you do. None of that is yours. And yet, for the person who carries chronic guilt, for the person who has spent years managing other people's comfort, absorbing their discomfort, adjusting their truth to fit what others can receive, this line has become almost completely invisible because they've been living on the wrong side of it, not through carelessness, not through weakness, but because crossing that line, taking responsibility for what belongs to others, once felt like the only way to keep things stable, the only way to maintain connection, the only way to remain safe in environments where other people's emotional states had direct consequences for them. So the line blurred, and then it disappeared. And now without it, everything feels like it could be their fault. Every reaction, every tension, every moment of discomfort in the room lands as potential evidence of their wrongdoing. Because without the line, there's no clear place where their responsibility ends and someone else's begins. The Stoic practice, and it is a practice, not a single insight, is the slow, deliberate work of redrawing that line. It begins with a simple but demanding question. Is this mine? Not as a way of avoiding accountability, not as a rationalization for genuine mistakes, but as an honest inquiry into what actually belongs to you in any given moment. You said something true. Someone reacted badly. Is the reaction yours? No. It belongs to them, shaped by their history, their sensitivities, their own unresolved patterns. You may have triggered it, but you are not its author. You set a boundary. Someone felt rejected. Is their feeling of rejection yours to carry? No. Their interpretation of your boundary is filtered through everything they've experienced before this moment. It tells you something about them. It tells you very little about whether your boundary was right. You told the truth. Someone was uncomfortable. Is their discomfort evidence that you were wrong? No. Discomfort is not a moral verdict. People can be uncomfortable with things that are entirely necessary, entirely honest, and entirely right. This is what the Stoic line makes visible. Not that other people's feelings don't matter, they do. Empathy is not the enemy here. Care is not the problem. You can be deeply aware of how your actions affect others and still recognize that their reactions are not your responsibility to manage. Those two things can coexist. In fact, they must coexist if you are going to live with any degree of internal honesty. Because the alternative, the life lived without the line, is exhausting in a way that's difficult to fully articulate. It's the exhaustion of someone who never fully rests, who is always monitoring, always adjusting, always scanning the emotional atmosphere around them for signs that something has gone wrong and that they are the cause. That kind of vigilance doesn't protect relationships, it hollows you out. And eventually, the person who disappears into the management of everyone else's comfort loses access to their own. The Stoic line is not a wall. It's not a way of becoming cold or indifferent or disconnected from the people around you. It's a way of knowing where you end and where others begin. And that knowledge, simple as it sounds, is the foundation of everything that comes next. Reclaiming trust in your own mind. At some point, the work stops being about understanding the pattern and starts being about something harder, learning to trust yourself again. Not in the abstract sense, not as a concept or an affirmation you repeat until it starts to feel true, but in the most practical, immediate sense, in the moment, in the conversation, in the split second between having a perception and deciding what to do with it. That's where the real work lives. Because everything covered so far, the pattern, the shadow, the fear, the distorted responsibility, the line between yours and not yours, all of it is preparation for this moment. The moment when something happens, and your gut registers it clearly, and the old voice starts to rise, and you have a choice. Not a dramatic choice, not a life-changing decision. A small one. Do you trust what you just felt, or do you override it? And that choice, made quietly, repeatedly in ordinary moments, is how trust is either rebuilt or further eroded. Most people approach self-trust as if it's something that needs to be earned back all at once. As if there's a threshold you cross, a moment of clarity so complete, an insight so total, that from that point forward you simply know your own mind and doubt falls away. That's not how it works. Trust is rebuilt the same way it was dismantled, slowly, incrementally, through small moments that accumulate into something solid. It starts with noticing, not analyzing, not judging, not immediately asking whether your perception is accurate or fair or justified, just noticing that you had a reaction, that something landed in a particular way, that your body registered something before your mind had a chance to edit it. That registration, that first, unfiltered signal, is information. It may not be complete information. It may need context, reflection, conversation. There will be times when you examine it and discover that it was shaped by something old, something that doesn't fully apply to the present situation, and that's valuable to know. But you can't examine what you've already dismissed. You can't work with a signal you overrode before you even acknowledged it existed. So the first step, the most fundamental step, is simply allowing the perception to exist. Giving it space, not immediately subjecting it to the committee of voices that want to question it, qualify it, find the ways it might be wrong, just letting it be there. And then, from that place of acknowledgement, asking honestly, what is this telling me? Not is this convenient? Not will this cause conflict? Not what will happen if I act on this? Just, what is this telling me? That shift, from suppression to inquiry, is where self-trust begins to return. It also requires something that doesn't come easily to people who have spent years in self-doubt. It requires tolerating the discomfort of being uncertain without immediately resolving that uncertainty through self-blame, because self-blame is fast. It's familiar. It closes the loop quickly. It gives the mind somewhere to go when the ambiguity of a situation becomes too uncomfortable to sit with. But self-trust requires staying in the ambiguity a little longer, resisting the pull toward the familiar answer. It must be my fault, long enough to ask whether that answer is actually true. That pause, that small, deliberate resistance. That's where the pattern begins to change. And over time, not immediately, not linearly, but over time, something shifts in how you move through the world. You start catching yourself mid-override, noticing the moment when the editing begins. Recognizing the voice that says maybe you're wrong before it has fully formed, and asking with genuine curiosity, rather than defensiveness, maybe. But maybe not. Let me actually look. You start staying with your perceptions a little longer before dismissing them, letting your first reaction exist before your second reaction tries to replace it, giving yourself the same basic consideration you would extend without hesitation to anyone else you cared about. Because that's ultimately what self-trust is. It's not certainty. It's not the absence of doubt. It's not some permanent state of unshakable confidence in every perception you've ever had. It's the willingness to take yourself seriously, to treat your own experience as valid data, not infallible, not beyond examination, but worthy of honest consideration, to be for yourself the kind of witness you've always been for others, fair, patient, willing to look before drawing conclusions. That's not a small thing. For someone who has spent years learning to doubt themselves first, to question their own perception before anyone else had the chance, to carry guilt as a default position regardless of what actually happened. Taking themselves seriously is an act of profound courage, and it begins not with a grand declaration. It begins with a pause, a moment of not immediately agreeing with the voice that says you were wrong. A moment of staying with what you actually felt, what you actually saw, what you actually knew before the editing began. That moment, small as it is where you start coming back to yourself. Stop carrying what was never yours. There's a weight you've been carrying for a long time. You know the one. It doesn't have a clear shape. It doesn't belong to a single memory. It's just there. A quiet heaviness, sitting between your chest and your thoughts, making everything feel harder than it should. You've tried to understand it, tried to trace it back, tried to make sense of why it never really leaves. But everything this video has been pointing to, slowly, carefully, comes down to one realization. Most of that weight isn't yours. It never was. It belongs to expectations placed on you before you were old enough to question them, to emotional environments you had to survive, not understand, to relationships where being accepted meant becoming someone smaller. It belongs to every moment you learned, directly or indirectly, that being yourself was too much. So you adapted. Of course you did. You were trying to belong, trying to stay safe, trying to make sense of something that didn't make space for you, but you're not there anymore, and the weight is still here. Not because you're weak, not because you failed to let it go, but because no one ever showed you that it was never yours to carry. That guilt, it was placed on you. That doubt, it was taught. That quiet feeling that something is wrong with you, even when nothing is, that was never the truth. It was a story, a necessary one once, but still just a story. And stories can be questioned. They can be rewritten, not all at once, but slowly, through small moments of honesty. So the next time the weight shows up, pause and ask yourself something simple. Is this mine? Did I create this, or did I just learn to carry it? And if the answer is no, you can put it down. Not with force, not with anger, just quietly. This is not mine. That sentence changes everything, because it doesn't require certainty. It doesn't require full understanding, only honesty. The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius wrote that much of our suffering doesn't come from what happens, but from what we continue to hold. And Carl Jung saw the other side of it. What you suppress doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for you to stop abandoning yourself and return to who you were before you learn to doubt your own mind. That version of you is still there, not broken, not lost, just quiet, because quiet felt safer. But safety is not the same as being alive. And somewhere inside you, you've always known that. This is the end of the video, but not the end of the process. The process continues every time you notice the guilt and don't immediately believe it. Every time you feel the urge to apologize and choose to stay grounded instead. Every time you pick up a weight and actually look at it. That's how it changes. Quietly, permanently, not by becoming someone new, but by returning to who you were before you learned to question yourself first. That's why you felt guilty, even when you were right. Not because you were wrong, but because you were trained to doubt yourself before anyone else could, and now you can stop.